All right. Ready to dive into something pretty massive with me today.
I am all ears. What are we looking at?
The Leveson inquiry.
Okay, I've heard bits and pieces, but never really dove in.
You're in for a wild ride, let me tell you.
It's one of those things, you know? Huge in the UK, ripples everywhere else.
Exactly. And it all starts with this big old report.
Published back in 2012, right? November, if memory serves.
You got it. But here's the thing. This report, it's just part one.
Part one of.
A much bigger saga. See, this part, it's all about the big picture.
Ah, so not just the nitty-gritty details of what went down.
Nope. This is about the culture, the practices, the whole shebang.
I see, setting the stage for everything to come. So what's the backdrop? What kicked all this off?
2011. Big year. The UK gets slammed by that phone hacking scandal.
News of the world!
Ding, ding, ding.
Major tabloid. Shut down completely. A real shakeup.
Total earthquake.
Yeah.
And amidst all that chaos, Parliament says, right, enough is enough. We need an inquiry.
Hence the Leveson inquiry. Makes sense. Get to the bottom of it all.
Exactly. But they knew this wasn't just any old inquiry. This was big. They needed someone who could handle it. Enter Lord Justice Leveson.
Heard the name, but refresh my memory. Why him?
Impartial as they come. Deep understanding of the law, the whole package.
The weight of the whole UK press on his shoulders. No pressure. So what was his mission? What was he tasked with figuring out?
The million-dollar question. How do you balance a free press?
Absolutely essential for a functioning democracy.
With the potential for that freedom to be, well, abused.
Because we all know it can be. Power can corrupt and all that.
Sadly, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the Leveson inquiry so fascinating. It's this core tension. Freedom versus responsibility. And we've got some amazing insights from the inquiry report itself. Big thinkers grappling with this very issue. Quotes that'll make you go, never thought of it that way.
Like who? Give me some names.
Okay, ready for this? Lord Stain.
The judge.
Oh, the one and only. He called freedom of expression the lifeblood of democracy.
Hard to argue with that. A free press holds power to account.
Exactly. But then you've got Professor Chris McGowan, big ethics guy.
And he says,
He throws out this caution. What happens when just a few powerful voices dominate? How does that shape public opinion? Does it?
it's a scary thought. A concentrated media landscape controlling the narrative. It's something the inquiry really dug into. And back then you had the Press Complaints Commission, the PCC.
They were supposed to be the watchdogs, right?
Yeah.
Keeping everyone in line.
The idea was self-regulation, the press policing itself.
But how's that working out?
Well, even before Leveson, there were whispers. Was it truly independent?
Because if the press is policing itself, who's to say they'll be tough on themselves when things go wrong?
Exactly. And spoiler alert, Leveson found some, shall we say, areas for improvement.
To put it mildly, I mean, we're talking about questionable reporting tactics left and right.
Not exactly a glowing review of the UK press. This was about the entire system.
Right. Not picking on individuals, but looking at the bigger picture.
Systemic issues that allowed bad behavior to flourish. And boy, did it flourish.
We're talking about journalists getting way too cozy with politicians.
Mm.
And a culture of fear that kept people silent.
Nobody wanting to rock the boat, even when they knew something was wrong.
Exactly. Now, we're not naming names just yet, but trust me, there were some real head-scratchers. Like, remember that whole Operation Motorman thing? Hundreds of journalists caught buying up personal information. That's a whole other can of worms.
Oh, yeah, that was big. A real wait, what moment.
Major red flag. Right. And then there's that for Neville email.
Ooh, yes. That email, talk about a mystery wrapped in an enigma.
One little email, but it hints at a much bigger story.
Like a loose thread that could unravel the whole thing. Who is this Neville? Anyway.
The plot thickens.
Seriously, it's like something out of a movie. All these whispers, these hints that Neville was this shadowy figure at the top.
Well, did they ever figure out who this Neville was?
They had their suspicions, of course. Some thought it was Neville Thurlback.
Hold on, remind me. Who was he again?
He was a big deal at the News of the World. An editor. High up the food chain.
Okay, right. So they thought this email might have been going straight to the top.
Potentially. And that's what made it so explosive. It wasn't just some rogue reporter, you see.
This email suggested that higher-ups might have known what was going on all along.
Exactly. A potential cover-up. And remember, the police were investigating all this too.
Which adds a whole other layer of complexity. They were dealing with the phone hacking, but also counterterrorism efforts, right?
All happening at the same time. Huge pressure on the police. And the inquiry, it lays all that out.
So they weren't shying away from the tough questions.
Not at all. They dug into how the police handled things, the decisions that were made.
Because it's not hard to imagine how things could get messy.
You've got the police investigating potential criminal activity, but at the same time, they rely on the press.
For information, for getting the word out.
Exactly. It's a delicate dance.
Okay.
And the Furneville email, it threw a wrench in everything.
How so?
Well, the police, they knew about this email, but they didn't really pursue it at the time.
Why not? Too busy with everything else.
Partly, but they also didn't have absolute proof that this Neville knew the information was obtained illegally.
Ah, so they were playing it safe, focusing on what they could prove.
Precisely. They were building their case against the reporter, Goodman, and Mulcair, the private investigator. They had them dead to rights.
So they let the Neville thing slide.
For the time being. But then, in 2010, the whole phone hacking scandal blew up again.
The Guardian's reporting. Right?
Exactly. They really pushed the issue, wouldn't let it go.
And suddenly, public outrage went through the roof.
Parliament had no choice but to launch new inquiries. A whole thing snowballed.
And that's when they finally went back to the Furneville email.
Exactly. They started looking at all the evidence they'd initially set aside.
Wow. Talk about a chain reaction. One email, years later, still causing shockwaves.
It shows you the power of a single piece of evidence. And it reminds me something else Leveson uncovered, something that's really stuck with me.
Lay it on me.
Operation Motorman. Oh, remember how we were talking about journalists buying personal information?
Oh yeah, hundreds of them. What kind of information are we talking about here?
All sorts. Phone numbers, addresses, even ex-directory numbers. Stuff that should have been confidential.
Wait, seriously, ex-directory numbers. How are they getting that?
That's the million-dollar question. It suggests there were leaks, people selling information they shouldn't have had access to.
And this was all traced back to one guy, right?
Steve Whittemore, a private investigator. He ran this whole operation, like a one-stop shop for personal data.
So journalists were going to him to dig up dirt.
Some, yes, but it wasn't just journalists. Insurance companies, lawyers, even people going through nasty divorces.
Wow, so this was way bigger than just the press. It was a whole industry.
Exactly, this whole underbelly of information being bought and sold.
It's kind of creepy when you think about it. Like, who's buying my information?
And for what purpose, right? The thing is, a lot of people probably didn't even realize it was happening.
They had no idea their information was out there.
Exactly, and that's part of what made the inquiry so important. It brought all this to light.
But did any of the journalists get in trouble for buying this information?
Legally. Not really. See, it was the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, that went after Whittemore.
They were the ones who shut down his whole operation.
Yep. And they didn't really go after the journalists who used his services.
Interesting. So it was legal for the journalists to do this.
That's where it gets murky. It was a bit of a gray area. The ICO, they were focused on shutting down Whittemore, not necessarily prosecuting everyone who had used him.
But even if it wasn't illegal, wasn't it still, ethically questionable?
Absolutely. And that's a key point the inquiry raised. Just because something is technically legal doesn't mean it's right.
Especially when it comes to people's private information.
Exactly. And that's what makes the Leveson inquiry so fascinating. It's not just about black and white, right and wrong. It's about those gray areas, those ethical dilemmas.
And those dilemmas, they don't just disappear once the inquiry is over.
Nope. If anything, they're even more relevant today.
So what does all this mean for us, the average person just trying to stay informed?
It means we have to be savvy. We can't just blindly trust everything we read.
Which, let's face it, is easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. But that's where media literacy comes in.
Media literacy. What's that? Is that like knowing how to spot a fake news website?
That's part of it, but it's much broader than that. It's about being aware of how information is produced, how it's spread, and how it can be manipulated.
Okay, so how do we become more media literate?
Well, for starters, we need to acknowledge that we all have biases.
Biases, you mean like preferring one news source over another?
Exactly. Or having preconceived notions about certain topics or people. The key is to be aware of those biases so they don't cloud our judgment.
So it's not just about what we read, but how we read it.
Precisely. And don't be afraid to branch out. Get your news from a variety of sources.
Don't just stay in your own little echo chamber.
Exactly. The more diverse your sources, the more well-rounded your understanding of an issue will be.
That makes sense.
And don't be afraid to dig deeper if something feels off. If a story seems incomplete or biased, see if other outlets are reporting on it differently.
So if something smells fishy, it probably is.
Exactly. And pay attention to the language being used. Is it overly sensationalized? Are there emotional appeals designed to sway your opinion?
Like those clickbait headlines you see everywhere.
Exactly. Those can be signs that a story is more about grabbing your attention than presenting balanced information.
It's all about getting those clicks, right?
Sadly, yes. And speaking of clicks, always look at the source of information.
You mean like, is it coming from a reputable news organization?
Exactly. Or is it some random website or social media account known for spreading misinformation?
So don't just believe everything you see on the internet.
Precisely. And that's especially true for social media. It's so easy to hit that share button without really thinking about where the information is coming from.
We've all been there.
Ag-
Like, oh, this confirms my worldview. Share.
But taking those few extra seconds to check the source can save you from spreading misinformation.
Good point. It's all about being a conscious consumer of information. This has been eye-opening. The Leveson inquiry, it wasn't just about exposing bad behavior. It was a wake-up call for all of us.
Absolutely. A reminder that a free press is vital, but it only works if we hold it accountable.
And that we all have a role to play in separating fact from fiction.
Couldn't have said better myself.
It's been quite the deep dive, that's for sure.
Mm.
The world of the UK press, all its twists and turns. It makes you realize that nothing is as simple as it seems.
And that's the beauty of it, right? There's always more to uncover, more to learn.
Well, on that note, I think we've done enough digging for one day. But stay tuned, because next time, we're going even deeper.
Can't wait.
It's like we've been handed this huge puzzle, right? All these pieces, these stories, these ethical dilemmas.
And like any good puzzle, it's not about just fitting the pieces together. It's about understanding the bigger picture they create.
So where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, for starters, it's important to remember that the Leveson inquiry wasn't just some abstract exercise.
It wasn't just about exposing what went wrong in the past.
Exactly. It was about trying to create a better future for the press and for society as a whole.
Which is a pretty tall order, considering all the complexities we've uncovered.
Oh, absolutely. It's messy, it's challenging, and there's no easy fix. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
So what can we actually do? As individuals, I mean. What's our role in all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something the inquiry grappled with, too.
Because it's easy to feel powerless, right? Like, these are big institutions, powerful people. What difference can we really make?
It's easy to feel that way, but it's not entirely true. We have more power than we think.
Really? How so?
Well, for one thing, we're the audience. We're the ones consuming the news, supporting these institutions.
So we have a say in who and what we give our attention to.
Precisely. And that choice, that act of conscious consumption, it matters.
So if we don't like what we see, we can choose to look elsewhere.
Exactly. Support ethical journalism, hold outlets accountable for their actions. Don't be afraid to call out bias or misinformation when you see it.
Because if enough people do that, it can actually make a difference.
It can. It sends a message both to the outlets themselves and to other consumers of information.
That's empowering. So it's not just about being passive recipients of information. It's about being active participants in shaping the media landscape.
You've got it. And it all starts with each of us making conscious choices about the information we consume and share.
That's a powerful thought. So before we wrap up, any final words of wisdom? What's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive into the Leveson inquiry?
I think the biggest takeaway is that a free and independent press is essential for a healthy democracy. But that freedom comes with a responsibility, both for the press itself and for us, the public.
To be critical thinkers, to question what we read, to demand better from the institutions that inform us.
Exactly. It's a two-way street. We need a press that's accountable to the public and a public that's engaged and informed enough to hold them accountable.
Yeah, and that's something worth fighting for, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Every single day.
Well said. It's been quite the journey. Exploring the world of the UK press, uncovering scandals, grappling with ethical dilemmas.
It's been an eye-opener, that's for sure.
But at the end of the day, it's a reminder that information is power, and it's up to us to use that power wisely.
Couldn't agree more.
So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay critical, and keep asking those tough questions. Until next time.